Imagine waking up one morning, going to the bank to withdraw your savings, and discovering that every dollar you ever saved is simply gone. No warning. No explanation. Now imagine millions of Americans experiencing that same nightmare at the exact same time. The Great Depression wasn't just an economic crisis. It was a time when banks collapsed overnight, families lost everything, and people who once lived comfortable lives suddenly found themselves standing in breadlines just to survive. But what most history books don't tell you is that the reality of the Great Depression was far darker than the story we usually hear. The day America's wealth vanished. In the late 1920s, America looked unstoppable. The stock market was booming. Factories were producing more goods than ever before. New inventions like radios and automobiles were transforming everyday life. To many Americans, it felt like the country had entered a new golden age of wealth. People invested their life savings in the stock market. Some even borrowed money just to buy more stocks, believing prices would rise forever. Wall Street was filled with confidence. But beneath the surface, the system was dangerously fragile. Many stocks were massively overpriced. Banks were using depositors' money to make risky investments. And millions of Americans were buying stocks with borrowed money they could never repay if the market turned. Then came October 1929. Panic suddenly swept through Wall Street. Investors began selling their stocks as fast as possible, afraid prices would crash. Within hours, the market started collapsing. Traders shouted across the floor. Phones rang non-stop. People desperately tried to sell before everything lost its value. But there were no buyers. In just a few days, billions of dollars disappeared. Fortunes that had taken decades to build were wiped out almost instantly. And for many Americans, this was only the beginning of the disaster. Because what followed the crash would destroy banks, businesses, and entire communities across the United States. And the worst part? Most Americans had no idea how bad things were about to get. When the banks started to die. After the stock market crash of 1929, many Americans believed the crisis would pass quickly. But something far more dangerous was already beginning to spread across the country. Banks started to fail. At that time, banks were not protected the way they are today. There was no federal insurance to protect people's savings. If a bank collapsed, the money inside it often disappeared with it. And that is exactly what began happening. Rumors would spread through a town that a bank might be in trouble. Within hours, hundreds of frightened people would rush to withdraw their savings. These scenes became known as bank runs. Crowds formed outside bank doors before sunrise. People pushed and shouted, desperate to get their money before it was too late. But the banks didn't actually have all that money available. Most of it had been invested in businesses, loans, or the stock market. So when too many people tried to withdraw their savings at once, the banks simply ran out of cash. One by one, banks began shutting their doors. By the early 1930s, thousands of American banks had collapsed. For millions of families, it meant something terrifying. Everything they had saved for years. Their life savings, retirement money, college funds, was suddenly gone forever. Entire communities lost their financial foundations overnight. But the damage didn't stop with the banks. As banks disappeared, businesses could no longer get loans. Factories could no longer pay workers. Stores had fewer customers. And slowly, a new crisis began spreading across the country. Mass unemployment. Factories shut down. Businesses closed their doors. Construction projects stopped completely. By 1933, nearly 1 out of every 4 American workers had lost their job. Men who once supported their families were suddenly wandering the streets searching for work that no longer existed. And for many Americans, survival itself was becoming a daily struggle. But the most heartbreaking part of the Great Depression wasn't just the unemployment. It was what happened to the people who lost their homes. Because across America, a strange and desperate kind of city was beginning to appear. Places made entirely of scrap wood, cardboard, and metal. Shantytowns that people would soon start calling Hoovervilles. And their story reveals just how desperate life had become in Depression-era America. Life inside the Hoovervilles. As unemployment spread across the United States, millions of Americans could no longer pay their rent or mortgages. Banks were foreclosing on homes. Landlords were evicting families. And people who had once lived normal middle-class lives suddenly found themselves homeless. With nowhere else to go, desperate families began building makeshift shelters on empty land near cities. They used anything they could find. Scrap wood, old metal sheets, cardboard boxes, even newspapers. These fragile communities quickly spread across the country. People began calling them Hoovervilles. The name was a bitter reference to President Herbert Hoover, who many Americans blamed for failing to stop the economic collapse. Hoovervilles appeared everywhere. On the edges of cities, under bridges, beside railroad tracks, and in abandoned fields. Some contained only a few families. Others grew into entire shanty towns with thousands of residents. Life inside these settlements was extremely difficult. There was no electricity. No running water. No sanitation. People cooked food over small fires and slept in shacks that barely protected them from rain or winter cold. Children who once went to school regularly now spent their days searching for food or helping their families survive. Food itself had become one of the biggest problems. Across America, long lines formed outside breadlines and soup kitchens, where charities handed out small portions of food to anyone who needed it. Sometimes the lines stretched for entire city blocks. Men in worn-out coats stood silently for hours, hoping to receive a bowl of soup and a piece of bread. For many families, this was the only meal of the day. And yet, something even more shocking was happening at the same time. While millions of Americans were starving, farmers in other parts of the country were destroying food. Crops were burned. Milk was dumped into ditches. Livestock was slaughtered. Not because there was too much food, but because prices had fallen so low that farmers couldn't afford to sell it. It was one of the cruelest contradictions of the Great Depression. Food existed, but people still went hungry. And as if the economic collapse wasn't devastating enough, another disaster was about to strike America's heartland. A natural catastrophe so powerful that it forced hundreds of thousands of families to abandon their homes. It would become known as the Dust Bowl. The Dust Bowl disaster. While Americans in cities struggled to survive in Hoovervilles and breadlines, a different kind of nightmare was unfolding across the country's heartland. The Great Plains. Stretching across Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, and Nebraska were hit by a devastating environmental disaster. Years of poor farming practices had stripped the land of its natural grasses. When a severe drought hit in the early 1930s, the dry soil turned to dust. Massive storms of dirt, known as black blizzards, swept across farms, sometimes reducing visibility to just a few feet. Houses and barns were buried in dust. Crops were destroyed before they could be harvested. Livestock died from hunger and suffocation. Families who had worked the land for generations suddenly found themselves without a livelihood or a home. Many were forced to abandon their farms, leaving behind everything they owned. Entire communities were uprooted. These families, known as Okies, regardless of whether they were from Oklahoma or nearby states, packed their belongings into old cars, trucks, and wagons and set out west toward California. They hoped for work, food, and a chance to survive. But the reality that awaited them in California was harsh. Jobs were scarce. Wages were low. Many were met with hostility from local residents who feared newcomers would take what little work was available. Despite the hardships, these migrants persevered. They worked as farm laborers, picking fruits and vegetables under brutal conditions, often for only a few cents an hour. Children were forced to leave school to help their families survive. Diseases spread quickly in overcrowded labor camps. Yet hope, no matter how fragile, was the only thing keeping them going. The Dust Bowl and the mass migration it caused revealed one of the most shocking truths about the Great Depression. Even when people escaped the cities, nature itself became an enemy, and survival required courage, endurance, and often sheer luck. But even as the Dust Bowl raged on, another force began to slowly reshape the nation, a force that would eventually help Americans start to recover. The road to recovery. By the mid-1930s, the United States was in its darkest hour. Millions were unemployed. Families were homeless. Farmers had lost their land. And the economy showed no signs of bouncing back on its own. But a new hope was arriving in Washington, D.C. In 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt took office with a promise to take bold action and restore America's shattered economy. He introduced a series of programs and reforms known as the New Deal, designed to provide jobs, protect the unemployed, and rebuild confidence in the banking system. Some of the most important initiatives included: the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, employed young men to work on public lands, planting trees, building parks, and controlling soil erosion. The Works Progress Administration, WPA, created millions of jobs by constructing roads, bridges, schools, and public buildings. The Social Security Act provided a safety net for the elderly, the disabled, and the unemployed. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, ensured that bank deposits were protected, restoring faith in the banking system. These programs didn't instantly fix the economy. The Great Depression would drag on for years. But for many Americans, they offered a lifeline, a chance to rebuild their lives with dignity. Slowly, cities saw new construction. Families found work. Children went back to school. And communities that had been torn apart by poverty and hunger began to recover. The Great Depression left a permanent mark on the United States. It exposed the fragility of the financial system. It revealed the suffering behind the statistics. It showed how resilience, community, and government action could eventually pull a nation back from the brink. Most importantly, it reminded the world that behind every headline about banks, stocks, or unemployment, there are real people struggling, hoping, and fighting to survive. The story of the Great Depression is not just about economics. It's a hidden history of human endurance, loss, and eventual recovery, a lesson that still resonates today.